Cognitive distortions are thinking mistakes. And every time you use that word should, it's a judgment about yourself. Hi, this is Jim Breon. Welcome to this YouTube channel where we discuss all things mental health. Today, the topic of discussion is something that's central to cognitive behavioral therapy, which is understanding our cognitive distortions. So the word cognitive simply refers to our thoughts. And the idea in cognitive behavioral therapy is exploring the ways that our thoughts, our feelings, and our behaviors are all interconnected and how they influence each other. One way to understand this in a graphic way is to think of something that we refer to as the cognitive behavioral triangle. It's a diagram that basically shows us how our thoughts, our feelings, and behaviors are connected and how they all influence each other. And cognitive distortions are thinking mistakes that we all get caught up into. We all have cognitive distortions. They're ways that we get tripped up into irrational thinking or thoughts that affect our emotions because they're distorting reality. It's helpful to understand what your cognitive distortions are, so then you can work on restructuring them, reframing your thoughts so that they're not creating problems for you. And I want to go through a number of different cognitive distortions and explain what they are, how they affect us. You might even think as we're going through this, like, is that one of my cognitive distortions? Is that one of mine? So probably the most common cognitive distortion or thinking mistake is what we call black and white thinking or all or nothing thinking. This is when we get trapped into seeing things that have to be one way or the other. It has to be this way or it's that way. And we lose sight of all the shades of gray in between. One form of this might be, a student in school, maybe a young person in high school or middle school thinking that everybody has to like me or I'm a loser, or somebody thinking that I've got to be perfect all the time. I can't make any mistakes. And if I do, then I'm a failure. And this kind of black and white thinking can cause real problems for people because you don't see the shades of gray and you can end up being very hard on yourself and hard on other people. Another common cognitive distortion is something called personalization. This is when we make things about ourselves when they really have nothing to do with us. Personalization is when maybe you walk into work and you say hi to a friend and they walk right by you, and then they don't say anything to you. The first thing that comes into your mind is, what did I do to tick them off? And you could probably spend the next hour trying to figure out why they're mad at me. When if you actually check out the situation, you might discover that, they were distracted and they didn't even see you because they got a fender bender in the parking lot. But we can make things about ourselves when they actually have nothing to do with us. And that can cause problems in relationships. Another common cognitive distortion is something called should statements, where a person is always telling themselves, I should be smarter. I should have a fancier car. I should make more money. I should be farther in my career. I should live in a nicer house. Should. And every time you use that word should, it's a judgment about yourself. You're telling yourself that you're not measuring up in some way. There was a very famous psychologist named Albert Ellis who worked a lot in cognitive behavioral therapy, and he was famous for saying that we want to take the word should out of our vocabulary because otherwise you can end up shoulding all over yourself. And it's kind of a way of making light of it, but it really is a serious thing. If you find that you're always telling yourself, I should be different than I really am, that's a cognitive distortion, it's a judgment, and it can affect your feelings about yourself. Because the way that this cognitive behavioral triangle works is if your thoughts are, God, I'm stupid, I can't believe I made such a mistake, Think about the feelings that those kinds of thoughts create. You're going to feel bad about yourself. You're going to feel like you don't measure up, like there's something wrong with me. And if that's the way you're thinking and that's the way you're feeling, you might be less likely to engage with people, to try to maybe take chances. But if you're thinking, you know what, I did a pretty good job on that. It wasn't perfect, but you know what, I'm doing a pretty good job. I'm pretty good at what I do. Then think of the feelings that those thoughts create. You might feel confident. You might feel contentment. And those feelings are more likely to make you engage and take chances. So you can see how these, your thoughts, feelings, and behaviors are all intertwined. A big cognitive distortion is something called catastrophizing. That's when our minds go to the worst case scenario when something bad happens. You hear some bad news and your mind jumps to the worst case scenario, and it causes all kinds of anxiety. It can make you worry unnecessarily, when in reality, most of the time, you know, that worst case scenario is never true. Magnifying and minimizing are two cognitive distortions. Magnifying is sort of when we tend to make a mountain out of a molehill, where we magnify the importance of something. Minimizing is when we minimize the importance of something. And generally, if somebody has one of these cognitive distortions, they also have the other. They might tend to magnify problems and minimize successes. You know, if something good happens to you, you know, you tell yourself, well, you know, the rest of the time I kind of screwed up, and you don't give yourself credit. So when you discount the positive, that's another cognitive distortion. It's when you look at the good things and the bad things, and all you can focus on is the negative. You might get a job review, and on 10 items you got 5 out of 5, and on one item you got, you know, room for improvement, and the only thing you can think about is that one room for improvement. That's called discounting the positive. Fortune telling or mind reading are a couple of cognitive distortions. Mind reading is when we get caught up in our own mind trying to figure out what somebody else is thinking. What are they really thinking of me? Why did they do that? Oh, they must be thinking this, or they must be thinking that. And it takes a lot of mental energy trying to figure out what's in somebody else's mind, when in actual fact, there's no way that we can figure that out unless we ask them or, you know, check it out. Emotional reasoning is another cognitive distortion. That's when we notice that we're feeling a certain way, and we think that our feelings must represent some fact. In other words, you try really hard on some project and it fails. It doesn't work out. And you have that feeling of, this feels like failure. And then you start telling yourself, I must be a failure. That's what we call emotional reasoning. And it's important to remember that feelings are not facts. So something might feel like a failure, but that doesn't mean that you're a failure. Other cognitive distortions are things like blaming or always being right. When we tend to blame other people for mistakes, problems, we don't take responsibility for ourselves. That's a cognitive distortion. And the opposite of that is always needing to be right. So once you identify what your cognitive distortions or thinking mistakes are, we want to then try to restructure our cognitions, learn how to unlearn some of those things. And there are various ways of doing this. One way is to use something called thought stopping. When you find yourself getting caught up in your mind, either personalizing or catastrophizing, you can tell yourself to just stop. You literally can say to yourself, stop it, stop it. I don't want to go down this path. I don't want to go down this rabbit hole. And you distract yourself somehow. Now, if you're in a crowded room and there's lots of people around you, you don't want to, be seen saying, stop it, then you can picture a stop sign in your mind, something that can kind of halt that thought process, and you distract yourself. Another way of restructuring our cognitions or reframing our thinking is to seek evidence or opposite evidence. So let's say that we're catastrophizing. We're making up the worst case scenario in our mind. So when you ask yourself, how often does that worst case scenario turn out to be the truth? Most people that I talk to realize that actually it's never the truth. It never turns out to be as bad as your mind makes it up. That's evidence to be aware of. It's actually evidence to fight against that cognitive distortion, that it's not true. So when you realize that, what you can do is you can pause and you can remind yourself, oh, everything's not falling apart. I'm just having the thought that things are falling apart. Oh, I'm catastrophizing. That's what's happening. And remember that it's never as bad as your mind makes it up. And sometimes you can kind of laugh at yourself. Isn't that crazy that my mind does that? And you can kind of pull yourself back from the brink. Other ways of challenging your cognitive distortions are using what we call thought logs, where we literally break down what was the thought that I had and what was the consequence of that. There's one process, we call it the ABCDE process. There's some activating event, which is something happens, there's a trigger. And then I have thoughts or beliefs that I create about what happened. And then those thoughts create some consequence. Maybe I start feeling bad about myself or somebody else. The D is trying to dispute those negative thoughts. And that process of breaking things down into the minutia of your thought processes can really help you understand the nature of your own thinking. Other approaches in CBT are making time for activities that you enjoy and that give you a sense of accomplishment. This is what we call behavioral activation, or breaking bigger tasks down into smaller, more manageable ones so that you don't overwhelm yourself, or gradually facing down your fears until they no longer stop you from doing the things that are important to you. Sometimes that's referred to as exposure therapy. So I think understanding some of these cognitive traps that we fall into can really help you to understand where you're making mistakes in your thinking. And if you can work to reverse some of those thinking mistakes, it can make a big difference in feeling better and actually change behaviors too. And if you're working with a therapist who does CBT, they can really go into depth into helping you learn how to reframe your thoughts so that you feel better and your life works better for you. I hope the video is helpful, and I encourage you to like and subscribe, sign up for notifications so we can let you know when there's more material coming out, and we'll talk with you again soon. Take care.